Eureka!
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 So like Sharona mentioned, I am Julie Ferguson. I'm actually an associate professor at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. And my research interest is network governance. And at my department, we look very much at questions of participation, inclusion, governing, governance, government, that kind of questions. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. Shall I start the presentation, Sharona, or would you like me to wait a little bit longer for possible new people coming in?
People will be coming in during, and that's fine. I always like to be kind of prompt in the time. So go ahead, and we're recording it so people can look it back. It's fine. Go ahead.
Okay, I will share my screen. I'll share the slideshow.
Do you want people to interrupt you, or do you want people to ask questions afterwards?
Maybe put them in the chats. I will probably see them popping up, and then I will answer them. And maybe at the end it's a little bit easier. But don't hesitate to share your chat questions, and I will at several points in the presentation ask you questions. So that will also be an opportunity to share your thoughts. Let me just see. Okay. Okay. So what are we going to do today? I'm going to talk to you, like you see here on the screen, about governing a just city. And the key concept today is collaborative governance. Maybe you had the opportunity to read the 2 articles I read, or I sent you, or at least the main points in those articles. You don't have to read them entirely, but just so you have the main issues. If not, please do go ahead and do it afterwards, because I think you'll find them quite helpful in the questions that you're grappling with, as far as I understood it from Sharona, of course. Why are we talking about this topic? Well, with a lot of societal challenges, there's urgency to introduce measures in order to deal, for instance, with climate change, inequality. I'm sure all of you are dealing with different main topics. And in dealing with these issues, often efficiency and effectiveness play a large part because of the urgency, right? So how do you reach these goals as quickly and inexpensively as possible? Also, technical arguments are often at play because of the major technical adaptations that we need to realize these innovations. For instance, to reduce fossil fuels, to realize a more circular economy, for instance. So the urgency and the economical technical approach, these often have the effect that governments tend to work in a top-down manner in realizing their strategies. And residents, businesses, civil society are often included only at a later stage when many decisions have already been made. Do you recognize this in your, oh, I can't see you anymore. Let me see where you all are. In your field labs? Yeah, a little bit.
I think it's called urban living labs. So the labs they're working on. Yeah.
Okay. Different word for more or less the same thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I see Jen Teresa laughing, so you'll have to explain that to me later. You don't agree at all that it's the same thing? Okay. Anyway, from a social scientific perspective, there's a lot of attention to the way in which we can pool resources more effectively. So to develop better social and technical innovations in a way that does justice to the different interests at hand. For instance, who benefits from changes, who is burdened even more, who gets to decide, who's included, who's excluded from discussions. So these, we feel, are important considerations in developing effective urban innovations that truly contribute to change for the better. So today we will look at ways to ensure governance is developed in a more collaborative manner, and from a perspective on a just and inclusive city. So this is what we will be talking about today. And just to start, I'd like to ask you for a moment to consider this statement, which one of my PhD candidates, Joachim, he's finalizing his thesis, states at the beginning of his introduction. So have a look at this statement and let me know what you think Joachim means by this statement. In recent years, we've seen a shift from government to governance in public administration theory and practice. Can you share in the chat what you think he means? And like I said, there's no wrong answers because it's your interpretation. Yeah, I said shift from a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach. Sure. Anything else? Okay, Geertje, the government is backing off more. Residents have to become more self-reliant, more citizens involved, less about the actor, more about the process. Yeah, more diffused power. And do you recognize this a little bit in your countries? Because obviously it'll be quite different from country to country, the extent to what this is possible. Recognition of new forces, for instance, media that enable people to communicate. It's a more fluid manner. Yeah. So an interesting thing about your responses, I'm just going to hide the chat again from myself, otherwise I have too many screens open, is that, yeah, there's different dimensions that you mentioned. You're mentioning it's a shift in power, shift from top down, bottom up, quite different dynamics that we're seeing. And another thing that's interesting about your answers is that some of you are emphasizing, you know, government as a thing, and other ones are mentioning also the aspects of governance as a verb, right? You're doing something. So I think what Joachim means, in addition to the responses that you all gave, is that with a focus on government, there's kind of an idea of a responsibility that is out there. It's beyond yourself, right? It's a noun. It's something that is. Whereas in governance and in governing, it's something that you do. It's a kind of more a concept of a shared responsibility. There's more the idea of a verb in it, an activity that you're engaging in. And I think that that is kind of the essence of what we're looking at in terms of realizing social innovations. That there's a move in public policy and decision-making from a central hierarchical unit, like you see on the left with the number 1, towards a more networked and multi-layered model. A couple of examples are included under the box number 2. And in this network model, societal parties such as citizens, businesses, knowledge institutions, many others are actively involved, more actively involved, because the decision-making is related to domains that directly affect them or which they have expertise on, right? That is needed for decision-making. So we're pooling knowledge, capabilities, resources, and mandates, as the article by Joachim illustrates. And this calls for a form of governance that involves collaboration and co-creation. So thinking about this shift from government to governance, so towards a noun beyond yourself, to governing, a verb, which is more inclusive and implies participation, we orient ourselves from a network perspective first on the group that is implied, okay? So who actually is affected by a policy, yeah? Are they included in the decision making? Have they been consulted? Are they actively excluded? These are all questions that we ask and then identify which relations are actually involved in this group, right? In these small examples, you see that there's quite, close connections. I don't know if there's people amongst you who did sociology, you will probably recognize this from social network analysis, but this is a useful way to identify within a group of people who is connected with whom in terms of decision making, in terms of expertise, and which social relations are activated and which relations are not activated. So what does the network look like? Who is missing, who is involved, who is excluded, who has an active role? These kinds of questions make it possible to also identify where responsibilities and roles lie, and that you can hold each other accountable to these roles and responsibilities, to really visualize what the network looks like, who the stakeholders are, who is supposed to do what, are they actually working together, and so forth. So all in all, network collaboration is a form of collaboration based on a more organic, fluid, I saw it mentioned in the chat, fluid, informal, horizontal governance structure, like these, as opposed to the hierarchical structure in number 1. And this is an interesting connection, which we see is also connected in the way decision-making occurs. So the shift in perspective, government to governance, implies on the one hand a political mandate to justify actions, and a social mandate also. So what I mean with that is, on the one hand, you have your elected officials representing governments, working often in a top-down manner to ensure that policies are realized effectively, and they're held to account to that. So in principle, there's nothing wrong with that, because if they don't implement those policies, people will not vote for them anymore. They won't have done their job. So this is a democratically justified way of ensuring that policies are implemented. At the same time, you have a social mandate within decision-making, right? So the participatory approach, which is more inclusive of different stakeholders and which elicits a different kind of collaboration. And it's more messy, right? The arrows are going all over the place. People do not necessarily have the same interests. They don't necessarily agree. There's a lot of different perspectives taken into account. And this tension between the representative democracy versus the participatory democracy, it leads to very interesting questions on how decision-making can and should be made, in which context and in which situation. So this is all a little abstract, perhaps. So let's have a look at the article I suggested for you to read by Joachim, my PhD student. He did a longitudinal ethnographic study at a market in Amsterdam, New West, which is a really interesting, vibrant part of the city. If you've been to Amsterdam, it's likely that you did not visit this part. And in fact, I have to admit that I've been living in Amsterdam for 25 years, and I think I only visited this part of town about 5 years ago for the first time, because when I was a student, this was a part of town that you really try to avoid. However, nowadays it's changed quite a bit, and I find it increasingly interesting precisely because it's a little bit more gritty than Amsterdam center, the old center, and it's very diverse, very culturally diverse. There's a lot of development going on. There's a lot of the original residents. There's a lot of people who are first or second generation immigrants. And of course, there's also the young professionals who can't afford to live in the city anymore, who have moved to this part of town. And it's so next time you come to Amsterdam, do make an effort to go visit it. It's called Plein 4045, Square 1940-1945. And an interesting part of this square is a public market, which Joachim describes in his article. And why am I mentioning this market? Well, here you see this tension between the municipal government and the participatory approaches which I described in the previous slide, where the municipal government is responsible for the actual infrastructure of the market. They're responsible for ensuring there's a market coordinator, that the composition of the market is interesting and attractive, that a code of conduct is maintained. They're responsible for the management, service tasks, financial completion, and so forth. But as this article showed, and what Joachim's research mostly focused on, was that the stallholders of this market wanted to deal with the excessive trash problems of this market themselves. So there was a lot of fruits and vegetables being sold on this market, and it was causing a lot of trash. It was really messy. It wasn't good for the profile of the market. People were frequenting it less. So the stallholders took the initiative, joined forces, and wanted to make the market more attractive and also becoming more circular. So they developed a new business model for waste management, ultimately also tried to negotiate a more just levy. So these are fees that they paid the municipality for the use of the market, and so forth, with as the goal a better profile for the market. So the article, which you might have read, but if not, I'd encourage you to do so because it's quite interesting. It explains a little bit how they went about this and how they ran into the tensions with the municipality in trying to participate as stallholders in the decision-making process. And see, in the Netherlands, we have a lot of measures in place that you can take advantage of as a citizen, as an entrepreneur, such as town hall meetings, a right to challenge, fairly short lines to municipal stakeholders, municipal funds to support such initiatives. And yeah, in that respect, the Netherlands is quite an attractive place to live in terms of participatory possibilities. And I'm sure that this plays out quite differently in different countries. It might, I mean, whether these are all possible in Romania or in I think in Italy, probably yes, Spain. These are interesting things for you to talk about, and I'd love to hear a little more about it in the discussion afterwards. Whether this is also the situation that you recognize, that there are actually a lot of possibilities to activate a participatory democracy, or whether they are there but not really encouraged, or whether they are there kind of like greenwashing, which is also sometimes the case in Netherlands. They are there, but they ultimately take decisions anyway. These are difficult situations in terms of governing, and interesting most of all. So in sum, this article shows how, again, this move from government to governance represents a move towards more participatory approaches, but this remains a delicate balance of mandate and responsibilities and inclusion. So you might say these are questions of justice. And that's why I'd like to introduce the concept of a just city. Have any of you engaged with this concept before? It's increasingly known. Yeah, I see a couple of people nodding. Well-known author related to this concept is Susan Feinstein, who published a fairly well-known book in 2014. I have the links included in the presentation, and Sharona will send it later on. There's also an interesting column, which is very accessible, which explains a little bit of the thinking behind the just city and very clear example of it. But governance questions are often about the distribution of resources. So what is a fair share of benefits? What implications do these benefits hold for others? For instance, do they translate into burdens for someone else in terms of access to resources? So for instance, in the column that I've highlighted bold below, she talks about a municipal park. The location was needed to construct a new Yankee Stadium, so the baseball stadium in New York. and the baseball club themselves, they said, okay, we're going to fund this themselves, we're going to do this ourselves, and it will be our project. But by taking hold of the location for the new stadium, that means, of course, that the people making use of the public park are not able to use that public park anymore. So what do you do with that? Anyway, this column is very interesting because it shows how, whilst the baseball club themselves took charge of the project and said they would pay for it all, ultimately the municipal government had to ensure that the burden of the stadium was taken care of, that there were new municipal parks were constructed, people were able to access nature, park, recreation, etc. Ended up costing the municipal government a huge amount of money, and the local people who initially took use of this park, kind of suffered. This is a big example, but it's relatively manageable. Another example for instance, the energy transition is in the shift to green energy sources like batteries, electric sources rather than gas in the Netherlands is an important one. We see that actually the resources that we need for batteries are depleting countries in the global south, for instance. There's a lot of pollution in Congo for the mining of battery, etc., etc. So here we see that, the implications for us to benefit and transition to this greener source of energy means a huge burden for the people who are providing the resources for that. And this is also an interesting question to think about in your urban field labs. I hope I'm using the right word now. To think about, by doing this innovation, who gets the fair share of the benefits and who gets the burdens, and how are these burdens implicated on other people in terms of their access to resources? It's a difficult question. So this thinking about a just and inclusive city holds a balance between these different forms of justice that I just described: distributive justice, procedural justice, recognition, and spatial justice. And I'd be very interested to hear some examples from your field labs in the discussion afterwards. Anyway, a lot of concepts to operationalize all this, to ensure for a just and inclusive form of governance. Collaborative governance offers a useful perspective on this question. So what is collaborative governance? Well, here's the definition, but rather than read this out to you, you can read it yourself, and it's also included in the articles, both articles I sent you. There are 5 characteristics that Joachim highlights. First of all, it's about collaboration across boundaries, right? So I'm sure, like many of you will experience in your field labs, it's not just about economic affairs, like in the example of the market. It's for a large part, the market is embedded in the Department of Economic Affairs, but it's also about social services. It's often also about education. It's about waste management, etc. So there are a lot of different governmental divisions involved. Another dimension is that collaborative governance is deliberative, consensus-oriented. So it's not just top-down, but you really want to hear what different stakeholders have to say about this. And it's not just saying that you want to hear it and acting that you want to hear it, but really deliberating, trying to seek some kind of consensus, recognizing that not all interests can be justified in decisions, but that you do recognize the different interests and are interested in knowing what they are and trying to find a consensus on the best way to proceed, so that really all the different stakeholders have been heard, so that the optimum solution is developed. Third characteristic is collective creation of decision-making and implementation. So there's co-creation involved. People are actively involved in coming up with a good solution, and ultimately someone will have to make a decision, and generally that will be the municipal government. but that the process of getting to that decision is co-creative and collective. A fourth characteristic is a constructive engaging of stakeholders, so giving room to exchange perspectives. And again, this does not imply that you all have to agree with each other, but that there is an equal sharing of perspectives, that people are able to share their views on what should happen and that these are listened to. And also, like in the small network picture in the previous slide, also thinking about who is excluded, right? If I just go back to that picture, you see here right on the left, do you see my mouse or not? Yeah, here you see one that is not included. Here you see one included. Here's a cluster of people densely tied. So the chance that these people talk to each other and are heard is quite significant. This one, much less significant. The ones at the top, you know, these are not included. So thinking about that kind of dimensions is rather significant in terms of engaging stakeholders. And the fifth characteristic of collaborative governance is the public character. So it's not a private situation, right? Because in private companies, there's a board of directors, etc. They make the decisions and it's implemented throughout the organization. In public organizations, it's different. Let me just check the time. Okay. So this is quite a lot to handle, I understand. For you, but also in practice. Therefore, we draw on the integrative framework by Emerson et al., the other article I sent you, which identifies as it were 3 gear wheels to operationalize these key features. Let me just pull them up. I'm not going to go through them point by point. But at a higher level, these 3 gear wheels, oh, hold on, just pop it here too. You see on the right-hand side, the capacity for joint action, right? So to what extent are there procedures in place, institutional structures in place that make it possible for people to participate and to construct joint action? What kind of leadership is there? Is the knowledge available? Is there resources? So like in the example from the markets, we saw that the municipality actually has funds available that people can apply for to make shared initiatives. The second cog, the bottom left-hand corner, is the shared motivation. Are people willing and able to participate? Do they understand the different perspectives? Is there internal legitimacy? So that means, do they recognize these perspectives as a legitimate representation, and do they have a shared commitment? So please note in this that we're not talking about agreement, and we're not talking about a shared interest. There's a shared commitment and a shared motivation, and it's very important to recognize that that you won't necessarily all come up with agreement on what is the most important overall, but that there is a commitment to go to that there is that you will realize a shared goal together, and that is the best way of going about it given the differences within the stakeholder field. The third cog is principled engagement, and what that means basically is that you agree, you have some principles on what is fair and good. So for instance, fair and civil discourse, open and inclusive communication, representation of all relevant and significant interests, and informed by the perspectives of the different stakeholders. This is all included in the Emerson et al. Article. So this all relates, in fact, to the conceptions of justice that I explained before. And like I said, please note that in terms of the shared and the joint dimensions that are mentioned in this framework, it's not so much about coming to an overall agreement as much as accepting and recognizing differences. So I understand tomorrow you will work on some of these questions and hear some examples the rest of the day of governing. So I invite you to reflect on these questions. let me just move all my screens. How can you apply these 3 dimensions of collaborative governance framework to analyze and strengthen your own urban field lab? To what extent are capacity for joint action, shared motivations, principled engagement present? And don't forget to have a look at the different dimensions, right? That we that are included therein. So these different aspects can be useful in helping to determine what degree of collaborative dimensions there are. And once you've identified that, what interventions can you come up with? How can you strengthen or better manage them to ensure that your stakeholders can develop a form of collaborative governance, can develop through this collaborative governance better solutions to the issues that you're dealing with? And I understood that you already did a stakeholder analysis, that you've identified different interests, the differences between them. So try and determine, using these 3 cogs, these 3 wheels, how well equipped are they to develop a form of collaborative governance together? And can you put these 3 dimensions of the collaborative framework to use in your living lab? I can imagine that this is a lot to handle. It's a lot of information, but the examples, have a look at Joachim's article. So the article deal about the market, see how he went about that with the stallholders, and which methods might be useful to analyze and to come up with useful interventions. So making explicit shared responsibilities, different interests, clarify expectations, the power dynamics, issues of inclusion and exclusion, the network analysis that I started out with. These can all be useful in that respect. So to summarize, just a few issues to consider in governing a just city through collaborative governance. Are in fact the 4 forms of justice duly considered across the 3 dimensions? So who benefits, who gains, who is included in the decision making, who is recognized, who is excluded, are they excluded involuntarily or purposely, sometimes also the case, and what implications does this have in terms of spatial justice? Are these duly considered across those 3 dimensions of the integrated framework? And like I said again, don't expect common agreement, because it's usually not likely that you will reach that, but recognition of and respect for the different interested, and coming up with a solution to your challenge with that perspective will be more efficient, effective ultimately than trying to seek common agreement despite these hugely different interests. And the final point is that, of course, collaborative governance can be operationalized within the formal government frames of what is possible, desirable, and legal. So this means that, of course, we are all within a municipal system. Often the municipal government is an important stakeholder in terms of taking responsibility for the social innovation that you're trying to realize. So it's important, of course, to have a look, what boundaries are there within that government framework. How can we better include the municipal actors? How can municipal actors better include societal stakeholders? And how can we do this in a manner that helps us realize our aims of social innovation? And that concludes what I wanted to share with you today. And I invite your questions, your reflections, and most of all, interesting are your ideas or your examples of how you deal with this, recognize this perhaps, or don't recognize it at all in your own living labs.
Eureka!
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 Eureka!